Hello everybody, my name is Annalysse Mason, and today I'm going to be talking about sex reassignment surgery fatwas and the unique discursive space that they occupy in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Okay, if you're anything like my parents, the title slide did not seem familiar at all, so there's a lot of background information that we have to tackle first. A fatwa is a form of Islamic ruling that exists within an Islamic republic, and in an Islamic republic state, the state is dominated, is mostly ruled by Islamic laws and Islamic jurisprudence. And a fatwa comes about when there's a situation or a conflict in which past Islamic jurisprudence cannot resolve the issue. Sex reassignment surgery, if you're not aware, is the surgical procedure designed to transform the external and internal reproductive organs to resemble that of the opposite sex. I've included transsexual and transgender in this slide because it's important to note that in an Iranian cultural context, it's much more appropriate to use the word transsexual than transgender. Both are relatively synonymous, and they refer to a person whose gender identity and personal identity does not align with their sex, with the sex they were born as. It's also important to note that transsexual folks are the majority of folks that are requesting sex reassignment surgery in Iran. I've also included intersex on here. Intersex is when someone is born with a mixture of male and female reproductive organs and are therefore unable to be classified as male or female. And even though they are not directly assessed through this research, they're very important in understanding Islamic historical understandings of the body and sex. Okay, so what is a discursive culture? When I talk about a discursive culture, what I'm talking about is this larger sociocultural environment in which our ideas about normative society are shaped and influenced and constructed. Multiple bodies of knowledge within society have a stake in constructing discourse, and I've listed a few, for example, like law, science, religion, and technology. And the processes of constructing discourse, they exist at all these different levels of society. They exist at the micro, meso, and macro level. So in this specific discursive culture, discussions about sex reassignment surgery have come about through a series of questions. First and foremost, the question being asked is sex reassignment surgery okay? And from this question, we ask, can the body be changed? For what reasons can the body be changed? And who is allowed to change their body? And is the identity of that person legitimate or justifiable? And even though many institutions in Iranian society, as in any society, have a stake in this decision, the ones that I've decided to talk about today are theology, religion, and medicine. So from a theological perspective, this issue has been addressed through asking questions like, does the Quran allow for bodily change? Did Allah create more than two sexes and genders? And in a more contemporary context, can the Quran recognize intersex and transsexual folks? An important thing to take away from theology here is to understand that there's no universal agreement, nor has there ever been a universal agreement within theological sources about the existence of sex reassignment surgery and transsexual folks. It's also important to recognize that the Quran is not the only religious source being consulted when trying to answer these questions. The Quran has consulted the Hadith, which can be considered the words and traditions of Muhammad are also being consulted, and the religious figures of the Kunta and the Mamsu, arguably some of the oldest Islamic intersex figures. Okay, so now that we kind of have an idea about how this has been addressed through a theological perspective, we should look at how contemporary religious authority figures have talked about sex reassignment surgery and transsexual folks more generally. The first reference to sex reassignment surgery came in 1964 from Ayatollah al-Khomeini, and he stated that it was possible to change the body to the opposite sex, but ultimately he did not make it a mandatory operation for transsexual folks. And because al-Khomeini was living in exile at the time, his ruling ultimately really didn't have any societal or political effect, but a fatwa that he gave 20 years later did have significant societal effect. And this fatwa stated that sex reassignment surgery was not prohibited in Sharia law as long as a reliable medical doctor, approved of it. And I'll be talking about this fatwa a little more in the next slide because it not only relies on the approval of medical officials, but it was following a pretty big decision of the Medical Association of Iran in 1976. I've also included Hujat al-Islam Karamenia, who's considered a trans-friendly cleric in Iran, and he really provides some of the most recent advice in regards to transsexual folks and sex reassignment surgery. Through the research of Afsana Najmabadi, we learned that Hujat al-Islam Karamenia, though cited as being a trans-friendly cleric, is within this situational context where the advice that he gives kind of contradicts trans-friendly notions of the body, gender, and sexuality. We learned through Najmabadi's research that this ask and answer process kind of gives way to a fluctuation of religious advice based on the context that it's being asked in. Finally, we have medicine. The institution of medicine has a really multifaceted place within discussions about sex reassignment surgery because in Iran, sex reassignment surgery is not only a physiological process, but a psychological process. And so I figured the best way to talk about these different institutions would be to explain what it's like to receive sex reassignment surgery as a person seeking SRS in Iran. So first, a person seeking SRS would go to the Tehran Psychiatric Institute, and they would receive up to half a year of psychotherapy. After this 6 months of psychotherapy in which chromosomal and hormonal tests are distributed, there would be a decision as to whether or not this patient is suffering from gender identity disorder. This was also called gender dysphoria and psychological hermaphroditism. From this, their case would be forwarded to the Legal Medical Organization of Iran, who would either approve or deny the diagnosis of gender identity disorder. If the diagnosis is approved, the patient and the case would be given a permit to begin sex reassignment surgery and its related procedures. Finally, I've included the Medical Association of Iran on this slide because of what I mentioned in the previous slide. In 1976, they gave a pretty stark ruling that sex reassignment surgery was only okay for intersex folks, and they didn't mention if transsexual folks could have it. And a lot of scholars have argued that this is what spurred Al-Khomeini's fatwa almost 10 years later. And I think it's a really important example it's a really important example for us to have because it shows us the interconnectedness of different institutions in Iranian society and how they communicate with each other. So what can be understood from this assessment of discourse? How does analyzing the discursive culture of Iran help us to better understand the sociocultural and religious environment in which transsexual folks are existing? To start, it helps us to understand that, it helps us in understanding that there's no universal, unconditional consensus among these institutions of knowledge. And that is not to say that one institution approves of SRS while another one doesn't. It means that within each of these societal institutions, there's such a spectrum of knowledge and a spectrum of opinion that really anything can happen, and there can be any form of opinion about SRS taken from any one of these institutions, especially in regards to who is allowed to receive sex reassignment surgery and for what reason they are receiving it. In conclusion, the ideas that I've surveyed, as well as the processes which have formalized these ideas, can be thought of as products of past religious, legal, and social decision-making. These ideas that I've shown you all through an analysis of discourse are arguably the same ideas which will continue to shape future notions of sex, gender, and the body in contemporary Iran. Thank you.